Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on Korean language, society, and identity. My name is Nicola Fraschini from the University of Melbourne, and I'm joining conducting this webinar today by my colleague Myung Park from the University of Auckland. Before starting the webinar, I would like to say that the University of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn, and live for all of the participants of these seminars. For us on our Parkville campus are the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples. We also recognize the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people as the original owners and custodians of the land and waterways across the Australian continent, and we also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future, and we also acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the academy. The topic of this webinar today, as I mentioned before, is Korean language, society, and identity. And this is the topic of the last issue of Melbourne Asia Review. Melbourne Asia Review is the flagship journal of the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can search for it just by Googling Melbourne Asia Review, University of Melbourne, and you can also subscribe to it, to the newsletter, to Melbourne Asia Review, and follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and also X. I would like to introduce the topic of this webinar before starting with asking questions to our panelists today. First, I would like to introduce the audience to the reason why we prepare these special issues and consequently the webinar today. The trigger for the special issue comes from consideration of that there is an unprecedented amount of people around the world who are learning the Korean language. However, we also know that there is an unprecedented amount of people that always, with respect to the Korean language, they actually lack access to language resources. So group of people who are marginalized or face discrimination and prejudice because of the variant of the Korean language they speak, because perhaps they don't speak the language of the capital city, they speak with a different accent or a different variant. And what we wanted to do with the contributions of the special issue of Melbourne Asia Review and also with the talks today at this webinar, first of all, we want to challenge the dominant ideology present in South Korean society regarding the language and the framework which is surrounding linguistic nationalism, in particular in South Korea. And at the same time, we also wanted to do this to acknowledge the growing multilingualism and multiculturalism within the Korean society, not just in Korea, but also in Korean community all around the world. And now I'll pass over to my colleague, Myung Park.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Myung Park, and I'm based in the School of Cultures, Languages, and Linguistics in the Asian Studies program at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. So I had the privilege in terms of being able to edit this special issue with my colleague Nicola at the University of Melbourne. And I would like to briefly introduce you to the reason why we decided to do this special issue. As you may know, South Korea has long been seen as a culturally and linguistically homogeneous country. There is this dominant ideology of linguistic nationalism, ethnic nationalism, one nation, one race, and one language. And this has resulted in essentialized constructions of Koreanness or Korean identities. This special issue of Melbourne Asia Review has been born out of the need to challenge this ideology of linguistic nationalism by foregrounding the perspectives of the people most negatively affected by it. South Korea's increasingly multi-ethnic and linguistically diverse populations, including migrants and returning migrants, children with mixed heritage, North Korean refugees, heritage speakers such as second-generation overseas Korean, and people and Korean language learners with disabilities. And there is a pressing need, as Nicola has briefly mentioned, to improve our situation in South Korean context. in terms of multilingual and multicultural education, and the role of global Inje and multilingualism discourse, multiculturalism discourse is very critical. Although Korean society and people's attitudes are changing rapidly, still at the moment, largely the notion of Inje is very class-based, often associated with elites with dominant high-status languages. Korean English bilingualism often underpins the notion of Inje. Global Inje and related multilingual discourse can play a big role in terms of shaping people's attitudes, for example. And these discourses and initiatives can be meaningful only if we start to look at and address languages consistently rather than differentiating, for example, high status languages versus low status languages, commonly taught languages versus immigrant languages, including Southeast Asian languages, and looking at them more dynamically, comprehensively, equally, and holistically, rather than statically looking at them in racialized ways. Given the nature of these topics, we wanted to achieve more impact in terms of knowledge mobilization by sharing research via publications that are aimed at wider audiences. Melbourne Asian Review is a great venue for this because it has a specific focus on making research findings accessible to wider policy, professional, and public audiences beyond researchers and academics that are working at the university. This special issue presents a collection of 10 critical reflections on contemporary issues of Korean society, language, and identity, unpacking the ideological, pedagogical, and practical complexities found at the intersection of these issues. So let me introduce our 4 presenters and panel members who have kindly contributed to the special issue, Korean language, society, and identity. We have Lucien Brown from Monash University. Hi, Lucien. Lucien Brown is Korea Foundation Associate Professor in Korean Studies at Monash University. Lucien is a social cultural linguist and pragmatician who is very keen to look at and study how languages make social meanings, cultural meanings in a multimodal fashion. And we have Shinji from Melbourne University. Hi, Shinji. Shinji is a lecturer in Korean Studies at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute. Shinji's research interests include heritage language maintenance and Korean language learning and teaching. And we have Jaran joining us from Kyunghee University based in South Korea. I had the pleasure to catch up with Jaran a few months ago when I was doing my research fellowship at the Academy of Korean Studies back in May. Good to see you here. Jaran is Associate Professor in Applied English Linguistics and Translation Studies at Kyunghee University. Jaran has been exploring a number of issues related to our special issue topic, from South Korean minority youth identity construction and their English and heritage language learning and use, to language policies for multicultural, multilingual children. We have our final presenter from Monash University, Daniel Piper. Daniel is Korea Foundation Lecturer in Korean Studies at Monash University. He specializes in modern Korean language and literary history, as well as in Korean sociolinguistics. I was, very happy to catch up with Daniel Piper and Lucien Brown and Shinji and Nicola at the Japanese Korean Linguistics Conference that was held a couple of weeks ago at Monash University. So it's so wonderful to see all of you and Jaran as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will start with a question. We'll ask a question to each of our panelists today. And then once we are finished with the question to our panelists, you have a function. If you look on the bottom of your Zoom's window, there is a Q&A button. You can use the Q&A to post questions during the presentation and also at the end of the presentation. Once we're finished with the 4 speakers, Byung and I, we will select questions for the Q&A time at the end. So I will start first with a question to Daniel. In your contribution to Melbourne Area Review, you discuss issues related to North Koreans and the Korean language variant. So I wanted to ask you, would you be able to illustrate what are the language differences between North and South Korea? And in particular, how speaking a different variant affect identity and belonging in the South Korean society for North Korean refugees? And lastly, which is even probably the most important aspect, what do you think can be done to improve the current situation? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I think North Korean Seitomin or newly settled people, refugees, often described in South Korea, face a myriad of challenges, including extreme competitiveness, sudden market economy, a lack of a network that most South Koreans grow up with, which makes it difficult to get jobs, make connections, get into university. But I think something that cuts across a lot of these difficulties and relates to them is this issue of language. It's been shown that even self-professed experts on North Korea in South Korea consistently rate the difficulties in language faced by North Korean refugees as far lower than North Korean refugees actually report themselves. So in other words, North Koreans actually see the language difficulties as much more salient and much more important in their daily lives than is often understood by those in South Korea. Some of the differences between the languages deal with or have to do with basic dialectal differences that have been there for many decades and even centuries. But I think the biggest difference now has to do with specific different state-led, especially in the case of North Korea, language policies that have led in a relatively short time to very divergent language varieties in North and South Korea. So in the case of South Korea, while there has been some state-directed movement in language policy and planning, most of it has been left to the whims of the public, as in most countries, just to let the language develop as it will. A caveat to that is the outsized influence of English, of course, in South Korean society. And before that, from the colonial period, the influence of the Japanese language. So that has had a very strong influence on the Southern variety. In the North, though, it has been very much more a state-directed language policy regime, especially since the mid-60s, with the so-called Juche turn that I call in every aspect of North Korean society, but for our purposes in language. There were a couple of conversations with linguists that they've been called by Kim Il-sung, the leader at the time. And these two conversations in 64 and 66 really set the tone for language policy in North Korea thereafter. The most famous aspect of that is North Korea's movement to create its own pure neologisms, that is purely North Korean words that are neither Sino-Korean in nature or influenced by Japanese, or especially not influenced by English. So this has created tens of thousands of new words in the Northern lexicon that, of course, most South Koreans, even if they know about them, they certainly wouldn't use them on a daily basis. So this is one area where the two countries have diverged quite dramatically. And this is one of the things that I did, or I tried to do with my contribution to this issue, is historicize the difficulties that North Korean refugees in South Korea face. Why specifically do they face these certain difficulties in language? So I point out in my contribution this history that I just went over of language policy and planning in the North, very state-directed, very strong for a relatively captive audience that is North Korea. Despite there were some 60,000, I think, attempts to change specific vocables and words in North Korea. Not all of those stuck, but even if we take the ones that did stick, the ones that, according to defectors, are used widely in North Korea, it's something over 20,000 words. And just taking those, there has been significant divergence in the country's languages. And another big difference that I haven't touched on yet is the influence of English in South Korean society. And on the other hand, the relative lack of English education in North Korea. Now, under the Kim Jong-un regime, there has been an overhaul of the English education regime. And now, more than ever, well, for about 3 decades, I would say, there was a turn away from English in any significant way. But in the past 15 years or so, English education has been revamped and strengthened in North Korea, and actually at the expense of Russian. Russian has been taken out of the curriculum, which was previously an important language. But it's not the language or the English that we see in South Korea. So it's almost as if it's being used as a tool for North Koreans to more effectively spread North Korean propaganda about their regime, rather than the English that South Koreans know and study. So while there is more English language study in North Korea going on recently, it's not really helpful to North Korean refugees in South Korea. And it doesn't prepare them for the onslaught of English loanwords that we all know are used quite widely in the South Korean language. So this is one major difficulty voiced by refugees, say Tunmin, in South Korea, of which there are about 33,000, I believe. Turning now to the final question, if I may, what is to be done about this? Like any major change in any country, especially in South Korea, I think it's time. Changes are happening in South Korea so quickly. There needs to be a transitional stage for these changes to happen. But I think one tangible thing that can happen is a change in the curriculum. We should start talking about North Korean refugees as part of this broader conversation about diversity and multiculturalism in South Korean society, which I think this venue is great for that. Up until this point, I think it's been common to see North Koreans as somehow different, or especially for older Koreans, as somehow, a residual enemy, right? And to put them in a different category than other multicultural people from across the world. But I think it's important to talk about North Korean refugees in the same conversation. And that means, among other things, changing the curriculum in schools. Also related to that, changing the curriculum at the so-called Hanawon, which is the institution that is charged with taking in newly settled people from North Korea and adapting them in a 3-month program to life in South Korea. I think this curriculum, and Mi-young Park, my colleague, has pointed this out in her research, this curriculum is still directed at helping North Koreans lose a part of their identity to pass as South Korean, instead of to see their identity as an asset, to embrace their identity as North Korean, and to feel like they can embrace that and be accepted in South Korean society. So those are 2 things that I would say that we need to work on. I wasn't checking time. I'm not sure how I am on time, but I think I said what I wanted to say mostly.
So is it okay to move on to asking a question to Zaran? Is it okay? So Zaran, you have done a lot of research. I'm very always interested in looking at your recent, articles and the topics that you are dealing with. And your research has been very motivating and encouraging as well for a number of colleagues here in Oceania. So you have been looking at the issues of multicultural education, multiculturalism, multilingualism, especially, marriage migrants and their mixed heritage children, looking at their language use, cultural and social adaptation, and identity construction. And, congratulations again on the publication of your recent book entitled Ecological Approaches to Language, Culture, and Identity, where, you look at not only the multiculturalism related politics, but also, mixed heritage students, agency, identity construction, and their power, in terms of redefining what it means to be multicultural children, what it means to be Koreans in, Korean society. Could you provide an overview of multiculturalism in Korean society, since this is one of your key research areas? And how does the current dominant ideology of Koreanness, or this rigid view of Korean identities, really affect the lives of migrants and their mixed heritage children? And also, what has really been done in Korean society in order to improve their situation? And given that, what could be done in the future in terms of policies to make South Korea a more multilingual, inclusive, and multicultural society, especially in the face of prevailing social stigma attached to them?
Okay, let me share my screen first, and thank you so much for Myung for all your questions. They're really big questions, so I had to create my PowerPoint slides because I want to like thoroughly tackle like what you asked, and I want to really think about what I want to say in front of people who are interested in this topic. So to first respond to your first question, I think it is important to first clarify how the term 다문화 or multicultural is used in Korea. So as you know, conventionally, multiculturalism sort of recognizes and values diversity within a society by, for example, like promoting the coexistence of different cultures and allowing people to maintain their linguistic and cultural practices. So in the framework of multiculturalism, people sort of promote the ideas of enhancing mutual understanding, tolerance, or respect different languages and cultures. But the term 다문화, which means multiple cultures, and often translated as multicultural in English, this term 다문화 has a very specific historical root in the country. It was first introduced in 2003 to really replace the term 혼혈, which means literally mixed blood, and it was to mitigate social and cultural and political discrimination against people with mixed parentage. And usually at the time, children with African American or white American GIs. So although this term initially didn't really draw much public attention, the Korean government officially adopted the term 다문화 to manage the influx of marriage migrants from neighboring countries. And essentially, 다문화 serves to classify who is included or excluded in the imagined community of Korea. And in this context, the Korean version of multiculturalism centers around a very specific type of family, typically involving an underprivileged Korean man, a female marriage migrant, and their mixed heritage children. And even as Daniel Pipper said, North Korean refugees were not included in this Korean version of multiculturalism. And it is indeed part of statist-driven initiative. And the recent discussion on 다문화주의 or multiculturalism in Korea really reflect an ongoing struggle over maintaining national unity while integrating different forms of diversity that sort of fundamentally question the Korea's hegemonic discourse of homogeneity. So moving on to Myung's second question, how the current dominant ideology of Koreanness affects the lives of migrants and their children. I think this question is closely related to why there had to be a social label like called Tamuna to denote migrants and their mixed heritage children in Korea. And of course, the existence and the presence of the term itself really shows that these people are suffering. So this new social construct of Tamuna exposes the hegemonic ideology of Koreanness and the normative assumption of homogeneity. And it marginalizes migrants and their children by signaling that any form of racial or ethnic, linguistic, or cultural hybridity in this territory is strange, and therefore it warrants a special label. And when someone is classified as Tamuna, they are marked as not fully affiliated or not yet full Korean. And their sameness or difference are systematically and hierarchically organized in the territory. And in that process, the presence of monocultural, which is assumed by the term multicultural, these native Koreans, the presence of native Koreans or monocultural Koreans is assumed, and it is naturalized because as the dominant group in society, they function as the norm. And ironically, the meaning of Tamuna is distorted to reinforce the ideology of homogeneity. And under this Tamuna category, even though many multicultural children are native-born Koreans and they are not easily distinguishable from other native so-called Koreans because their parents are all Asian origin, many of their parents are Asian origin, these children are stigmatized as abnormal and deviant. So for instance, they are frequently portrayed as marginalized and potentially threatening, and therefore governments should intervene so that they would no longer become a threat to the national security or the national building project. Alternatively, they are urged to leverage their linguistic and cultural resources and capital to enhance Korea's competitiveness as a nation. And this sort of fixes what migrants and multicultural children should look like or should be, and ultimately constructs them as the other. So in their everyday lives, they are often asked to disclose that whether they are really Korean or Korean but multicultural, or where their foreign parents comes from and why, whether they speak multiple languages at home, whether they're proficient in those languages, and so forth. And of course, despite the simplistic and stereotypical perceptions of the multicultural population, these multicultural children are not solely passive and docile. So in my longitudinal study on multicultural teenagers, they are sort of active to really understand the tensions between imposed multicultural identity and their own interests and understandings of themselves. So in that process, they try to contextualize their positions as teenagers, Korean and but multicultural, and they try to engage in different social relations to really imagine different selves in society. In this very tension between social structure and agency, multicultural children navigate a sense of in-betweenness all the time. So as both Korean and multicultural, and as speakers of both Korean and other foreign languages to varying degrees, they constantly juxtapose conflicting societal values when defining who they really are. So for instance, they are Korean, but simultaneously they are not Korean enough. They are marginalized and even considered threatening, but if they are lucky and try their best, they can be global human resources or inje for their country. And this ongoing tension of in-betweenness and the inherent paradoxes it creates, I hope, may eventually allow these people to challenge the dualistic oppositions between native versus multicultural and explore more symbolically powerful identity options that reframe the notion of Koreanness. And this relationship could really sow the seeds for larger structural change, I believe. In terms of what has been already done, there has been done a lot of things, especially in the field of Korean language education, as part of the efforts to integrate and assimilate these children into Korean language and culture. But out in 2013, when the legal revisions really undergo, there was a legal revision that includes bilingual education for multicultural children. So there was a big change, but I think there have to be more policy strategies to make Korea plurilingual and pluricultural. And I think one of the most important one is critical multicultural education, as I outlined in my Melbourne Asia review piece. So critical multilingual, multicultural education is essential for revisiting the notion of Koreanness, and it offers opportunities to deconstruct the perceived normality of a monolingual totality, combat the fears that multilingualism threatens national security, and question binary assumptions associated with Koreanness, like who is genuine Korean and authentic Korean. And to achieve these goals of critical multicultural education, I think implementing dual language programs in public education can be a very pivotal first step. These programs are designed to defend their rights to learn and use their heritage languages in the public domain. And it is important to emphasize the integration of both minority and majority language speakers in the same classroom, so that they can learn both content areas in both minority and majority languages, and they also can learn from each other's linguistic and cultural repertoires. And this will facilitate not just language acquisition, but also foster attitudes that really value and nurture all students' emerging bilingualism. And I think those two approaches can, I hope these policy strategies can be implemented in the Korean education system someday soon. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jaran, for this very detailed, but at the same time, very concise explanation of the issue. And thank you also for the very useful suggestion. And we hope that some policymaker will pick up all those suggestions. For the first two questions, we looked at the issue from a perspective within the Korean society. For the next two questions, we are moving outside of Korea. And the first question is for Shinji about Korean diasporic community overseas, and in particular in Australia. So we wanted to ask you first, how is the Korean language maintained in diasporic communities, and also in particular in Australia here? And also, again, which is perhaps more important, what can we done and what can be done to support Koreans in remote area of Australia to better transmit their language to the future generations?
Okay, to answer your question, in the Korean community in Australia, the Korean language is maintained relatively well. You might wonder what I mean by relatively. That's relatively to other languages in other ethno-linguistic communities in Australia. So I quickly share a table with you, which is from the study by Karidakis and Arunachalam in 2016. So this table shows you language shift to English in first-generation migrants from different countries or regions based on the 2011 census. As you can see, migrants from some countries have a high shift rate, some over 50%, even over 70%. So compared to them, Korean migrants have shifted to English to a far lesser degree, showing a shift rate of 9.3%. So this is actually lower than the shift rates of migrants from some Asian countries, such as Japan or Indonesia, even if it's not as low as that of those from China or Vietnam. So we can safely say that the Korean community in Australia has maintained its community language quite well. What's interesting, though, is that the Korean community in Australia shows differentials or differences in its language shift by some socio-demographic factors, such as gender, age, or religion. For instance, in the first generation, females tend to shift to English more often than their male counterparts do, or younger age groups tend to have higher shift rates than older age groups, or Christians, especially Presbyterian or Uniting Churchgoers, have lower shift rates than those with other religions or no religious belief. Recently, I have observed something interesting in language shift and maintenance of the Korean community. It is that Korean is actually better maintained in cities where more people with Korean backgrounds live. As you can see in this chart, which is from my own article in the special issue, the Korean communities in Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, with a large number of people with Korean backgrounds, have maintained Korean actually better than those in the other cities with smaller numbers. And not surprisingly, the same trend actually holds when we look at the language maintenance and shift of the Korean community by remoteness. And we can see from this chart that Korean is better maintained in major cities than regional or remote Australia. I'm actually reluctant to draw a causal relationship between the size of a Korean community and its language retention. It's because of limitations in using and interpreting responses to language-related questions in censuses for language maintenance research. Moreover, the figures that we see as language maintenance can sometimes be reflections of low English proficiency of the community. For instance, new arrivals from Korea who don't speak English very well might prefer, settling in big cities and urban areas with a strong presence of the Korean community rather than going to regional or remote areas, at least initially. So consequently, that might be the reason why we are seeing higher language maintenance in major cities than in regional or remote areas. Nevertheless, I'm not hesitant to argue that the bigger the size of the Korean community is, the better it can facilitate transmission of the Korean language to its coming generation. Now I actually live in Melbourne, but before moving here, I actually lived in Sydney for over 10 years. And Sydney has the largest Korean community in Australia. It actually has a quite large number of Korean community language schools. What it means to have a large number of Korean community language schools is that people can find one in their neighborhood or somewhere in a relatively short driving distance. In addition, many regular schools offer Korean as part of their regular school programs. Currently, in New South Wales, there are 49 schools that offer Korean classes. As you can see from this table by Korean Education Centre in Sydney, and most of them are actually in Greater Sydney. And many of these schools are in suburbs with a sizable number of Korean migrant families. And this is actually not the end of the story. When I was living in Sydney, I had GPs, dentists, optometrists, accountants who were Korean migrants themselves or children of Korean migrants. So these professionals were actually bilingual in English and Korean, fully functional. They can serve patients and clients speaking Korean as well as English. Just imagine children growing up in such social environments. They will not only have the opportunity to learn and use Korean at home, at school, and in their local Korean community, but also see that being able to speak Korean is actually valuable and their language ability can be a capital for their future. So I have to emphasize that the lower language maintenance rates that we see in regional or remote areas compared to major cities can be of concern, especially for its long-term effect, and we should do something about it. And moving on to answering your second question, Nicola, what can we do to support Koreans in remote and regional areas? Well, undoubtedly, Korean migrants and their children living outside major cities will face considerable challenges when it comes to retaining their community or heritage language. Korean migrants living in these areas will rarely encounter other Korean speakers outside their own homes. If none of their family members actually speak Korean, and these individuals won't even have a chance to speak Korean at home. And places to use and learn Korean or facilities for heritage language education that local Korean communities could provide, as I have described earlier based on my own experience in Sydney, will be absent in these areas. This actually means Korean migrant families living in these areas might not see the necessity or importance of maintaining Korean as much as those living in major cities would do. So awareness campaigns would be essential. Migrant families, not only from Korea, but also from any other countries or regions, should be educated about the importance of maintaining their community or heritage language. And this could be done through TV campaigns, social media, or any other outreach efforts. And there's also the need for stronger support networks. For migrants living far from major cities, the ability to connect with others with the same cultural and linguistic backgrounds, even if that's just online, can be incredibly valuable. So establishing remote networks for Korean families could help them feel more connected and supported in their efforts to retain their language as well as their culture. In addition, practical support for heritage language education is really crucial to help migrant families in these areas transmit their language to their children. There is an urgent need to provide children of Korean migrant families living in these areas with language learning programs. It won't be easy, but expanding online or remote language education that already exists could be a way. Some states, like New South Wales, offer online language classes, but these are mostly limited to high school students, only in years 9 to 12. And in Victoria, the School of Languages provide distance education in 13 languages, but Korean isn't among them. So making these online language classes available for primary school students or adding Korean where it's not offered would give children of Korean migrant families living outside major cities the opportunity to learn their heritage language as part of their formal education. And in cases where online language classes aren't available, resources such as self-study tools for teenagers could be developed. And for younger children, online classes won't be really ideal, as you can imagine. It's not very easy to make them sit and focus in front of the screen, even for half an hour. So resources for parents with preschool children can be developed and provided to assist them in helping their children with learning and using Korean at home on a daily basis. And for children in lower year levels of primary school, a remote learning program could be developed and offered. So, for example, the program coordinator or teacher lays out learning activities and provide materials, and children learn in their own time. But their parents actively supervise and help them with actual learning activities. There must be many other ways to support children and families in regional and remote areas. But just to sum up what I have mentioned so far, by providing more accessible language learning programs and resources, as well as raising awareness, we can ensure that Korean migrant families, regardless of where they live, have the tools and support that they need to maintain their community or heritage language. Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much, Shinji. Now let's move on to our questions that we prepared for Lucien, and then we'll have a nice discussion and Q&A at the end. So Lucien, I really enjoyed reading your article, just like any other article that you have written. And, you know, articles that you have inspired me so much over the many years. As a study abroad advisor and someone who researches study abroad students' experiences and language use in South Korea, I couldn't agree more with you and your concluding remarks in your article that since Korea is becoming a more diverse, multicultural society, it is so important that studying abroad in South Korea should be seen more as a multicultural, multilingual experience rather than pure Korean immersion. As you stated in your article, studying abroad can be such a positive and transformative experience for some students, especially Korean heritage background students. Thank you, Lucien, for referring to my work in terms of this. At the same time, it could be very challenging, especially in terms of navigating complex linguistic, cultural, racial ideologies and gender norms and gender-related ideologies in Korea, which may be very different from their own, especially since students often tend to view and imagine study abroad as a fully immersive, super friendly, uber supportive environment where they can easily interact with Koreans and practice Korean with them. Given this, we wanted to ask you in terms of the role of students, Korean and other language proficiencies and identities in their study abroad experiences. So firstly, in your view, how does the ability to speak Korean and English, which is seen as one of the most important languages in South Korea, and you have been focusing on this for some time, if I remember correctly, in relation to study abroad, affect the experiences of the study abroad in Korea abroad students? Especially for different groups of students, such as learners from Asian backgrounds and learners from non-Asian backgrounds, Western backgrounds. Secondly, how do students' identity factors, their gender, their racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds influence their study abroad experiences in Korea? And I know this is a big question, but what could be done by educators, you know, study abroad coordinators and teachers, you know, to better prepare students for their study abroad? I think it would be really useful personally for me as well, because, you know, I have been organizing study abroad trips for about a decade. Thank you, Lucien. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Myung. Very interesting questions, but also very challenging questions to answer. I think in terms of the linguistic ability of students, first of all, definitely students who go to Korea with higher levels of Korean ability and also potentially English ability, these are things which can become tools for access into Korean society. But it's simply a lot more complicated than that. And it's complicated by issues related to identity, as you said, and also these homogeneous ideologies of race and language, which already came up in some of the previous presentations, such as Daniel and Charan. So these kind of ideologies that equate Korean identity with the ability to speak Korean. And what I found is that due to this, in my research, there was quite often a disconnect between the actual Korean proficiency of participants and the Korean proficiency that was perceived for them or which was applied onto them by society. So I'll just give you a couple of examples from participants and individuals that I discussed in my Melbourne Asia review piece. So one participant who has the pseudonym Grace, she was a white American learner. She came to Korea with quite a high proficiency in Korea. You'd probably say she had kind of high intermediate proficiency. She was conversational in Korea. But she found that, the early stages of her study abroad experience were very, very frustrating because quite often she was not positioned as being a Korean speaker. My article that I wrote about her, I actually titled it, "Sorry, I Don't Speak Any English." And this title came from an experience that Grace had when she spoke Korean to someone, I think it was in a shop or a restaurant, and the person replied, "Sorry, I don't speak any English," in English, because the expectation was that that person would be hearing English rather than Korean, and it was tuned into that and misheard Grace's Korean utterance as being an English utterance. But so in the case of Grace, her proficiency was kind of always underestimated. Then the case of Daniel, who was a Korean German participant, so someone of Korean heritage, a very different experience. He was very fluent in Korean. He had spoken Korean from a young age, did not have much of an accent at all, but he found that he was very often criticized for speaking poor Korean, and quite often he got comments that his level of Korean was lower than it should be. And also when he tried to flaunt politeness conventions, this was something that he couldn't get away with. He was, corrected for using Korean that slightly went outside of politeness conventions. And he was kind of positioned as being an inauthentic Korean. So again, his Korean ability was in some way underestimated due to his racialized identity. And then I also looked at the experience of Rachel, who was a Hong Konger American. She described herself as Korean passing, so she could pass as a Korean, but she went to Korea with a very low ability in Korean. But she found that when she was going around in Seoul with other exchange students, because she racially appeared to be Korean, there was a big expectation that she would be the Korean speaker in the group. So from those three examples, we see that there are different struggles that study abroad students have to establish their identities as Korean speakers. I also talked a bit in my article about gender-related issues as well, including sexual harassment, which is something which unfortunately quite a few female study abroad students in Korea talk about in the data that I've collected from them. Now, in terms of what can we do to maybe better prepare our students for studying abroad in South Korea, given this kind of situation? Jaran mentioned earlier that in the context of South Korea, there's a need for critical multicultural education. I feel that we could kind of say the same in the Australian context as well. Particularly education regarding linguistic ideologies and ratiolinguistics. Our students who come to Korean studies programs come with their own monolingual ideologies that originate in Australian society, but also are exposed and inherit the monolingual ideologies from South Korean society as well, which they access through Korean popular culture, for instance, and also through traditional Korean language teaching materials that focus on teaching the Seoul standard. And then also study abroad itself, as you alluded to, Myung, tends to be positioned as this monolingual experience, an imagined monolingual utopia. As I mentioned in my article, this is kind of the ideal that you go abroad to study and you are 100% immersed in that target language. Going back to the case of Grace, the white American learner who I mentioned earlier, she went to Korea with this idea that when she was in Korea, she would speak 100% Korean and she would only interact with Koreans in Korean. But she soon found that, that things just didn't quite work that way, that often in interactions with Korean people, she was positioned as being an English speaker. And ultimately, she found that some of the most rewarding contexts for her to use Korean were actually interactions with other international students. She shared accommodation with an Iranian and also a Chinese Korean, and they would use Korean as their lingua franca. And this was a context where she learned a lot of Korean and got a lot of Korean speaking experience during her study abroad. And she also went through this shift in her motivation. Rather than focusing her motivation on monolingual Korean, she started to see herself more as a translingual international student, and to value the use of different languages, including switching between different languages in everyday life. So I think, coming back to the point that Myung made in the introduction as well, if we're talking about repackaging South Korea as being a multicultural and multilingual space, then I think we also need to repackage study abroad in South Korea in the same kind of way as a multicultural, multilingual, plurilingual experience for our students.
Oh, thank you, Lucian. And now I'm conscious of the time, but I'm conscious we have 3 questions. I'll ask the 3 questions. If you can keep it short and sharp, it would be great. We can go over time, it's not a problem. The first question is for Daniel, and it's about how do you think linguistic differences impact diplomatic efforts and perhaps cultural exchanges between the 2 Koreas?
Yes, thanks for the question from one of my Korean students, actually. Thanks for coming. Good to see you. I don't know if they really affect diplomacy in a big way, because at that level, and by this time, I think the 2 Koreas are aware of the differences to the point where they can get past any misunderstandings. But I will mention briefly 2 ways that relations between the countries affected language policy. One was North Korea's decision to do away with Hanja from 1949, whereas South Korea didn't. But importantly, to retain Hanja, that is Chinese character education, to retain that in the curriculum. And now actually North Korean students learn more Chinese characters than their South Korean counterparts, even though this is a relatively recent development. And the reasoning behind that was from the North Korean leadership that, well, South Korea still uses the characters, and in the event of reunification, we want to be able to read their writing to ease reunification. So even at that time, they were still thinking of possible reunification, and that was on their mind. Another thing I might mention is the joint dictionary project that is going on. At this point, I'm not sure of the actual fruits of this labor, but it may be more symbolic than anything. But this is a project to make a grand comprehensive dictionary of the Koreas, including North Korean and South Korean language. So 2 areas where diplomacy and language intersect between the Koreas.
Would you want me to move over to Ting's question?
Yeah, I think it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, is it okay?
Yeah.
Because Ting is my doctoral student. So Ting would like to go to South Korea to focus on multilingual families. So I think it's good for me to introduce Ting's question for Jaran. Is it okay?
Yeah.
So Zaran, Ting is wondering, in terms of your book project, Ting has been talking about her book, related, motivation in the past with me. So maybe she's interested in looking at your methodology and how you recruited participants. So let me just read this to you so that it's clear from Ting's perspectives. So Jaran, in your book, Expanding Ecological Approaches to Language, Culture, and Identity, I noticed your mention of a special organization, the South Korea's Multicultural Family Support Centers, which you use to recruit participants. I'm interested in how you perceive the relationship and interactions between this type of organization and multicultural families themselves, particularly in contrast to other social institutions like schools. Thank you.
Okay, so we had an insider here, and I have a lot of things to say about the recruitment process. It was a total nightmare. So it was just not possible at all for me to personally contact multicultural kids and their families. So I had to use a whole lot of my social networks and family networks to really have a center person to connect me to the organization. So not all multicultural support centers, multicultural family support centers will support research. They only supported my research because I had a connection with them, and that was the reason why I had to commute to Incheon from Seoul, because no center in Seoul wanted to help me in recruiting study participants. And precisely because these multicultural family support centers in Korea are state institutions, they are funded by state governments, and that means all their programs have to be monitored by the state government, and they only offer those programs that are helpful for the nation building project. So they offer Korean language classes, and they offer Korean cultural events, or they support counseling sessions for marriage migrants and so forth. Although some of those multicultural family support centers offer some publications in the heritage languages of the children, they are one-time thing, so it's not really super helpful for these kids to really learn multiple languages and practice multiple and embody multiple cultural practices. So I would not say there will be huge difference between what multicultural family support centers do vis-a-vis schools and other governmental institutions, because they're fundamentally the same. But I think that if Ting or other people interact with multicultural kids and families via social non-governmental organizations or religious organizations, and they will have a different dynamics.
Oh, thank you. And do you have a one-sentence answer? I'm conscious that we are going a bit over time, but Shinu is asking whether the low Korean birth rate, do you think it is influencing the urgency of adopting pluralistic language policies in South Korea?
Yes and no. The mere number of foreigners and foreign languages and cultures in the Korean territory, that pushes the Korean government to consider multilingual and multicultural policies. But at the same time, their primary goal is to produce Korean citizens with Korean national identities and cultural identities. So they are always dealing, they are always in the tension between nationalism and multilingualism and multiculturalism. So they're always in a constant struggle which one to prioritize. And so that means, yes, the presence of foreigners in the country will help, envision multilingual and plurilingual or pluricultural society, but that doesn't guarantee that the ideal world will be coming because of the state interventions of brainwashing them, like you have to be Korean in order to live as Korean or as a Korean citizen. So, so I think yes and no to that question.
Thank you. And perhaps we have 1 minute answer to the last question for Shinji.
I think it's going to be very difficult to answer in 1 minute, but I try my best. So yeah, it's really true that the Koreans living overseas, they're affected by especially the first generations who are trying to teach their children Korean to maintain their their identity. They force their children to learn the language because they basically, throw this idea that your parents are Korean, you are Korean, therefore you need to learn Korean. But I think it's actually changing in the younger generations, how they see the language and the connection between the language and cultural identity. And we need to see, it's going to be interesting to see that how it turns out. But I have the sense, especially those who grow up in Australia in this, multicultural environment, they will see that it's actually okay not to speak perfect Korean, even if they would like to learn and maintain the language. So we really need to see how it will turn out with the coming generations. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Myung, do you want to add anything before we conclude?
No, I'm okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to thank, first of all our amazing panelists today who agreed to present their piece here. I would like personally to thank Myung for co-editing this special issue and co-hosting the webinar together with me. I would have never done the special issue without you, probably. And lastly, I would like also to thank Melbourne Asia Review, the Asia Institute, and Simon, who is turned off his camera for facilitating and setting up everything on the webinar. And of course, all participants today, great questions. I hope you enjoy, you are interested and attracted by this stimulating seminar. And if you have been stimulated and curious about it, just have a look at Melbourne Asia Review. There are so many other pieces from other contributors who tackle this issue from quite different angles. And thank you for today.